The New York Times spent 3 months going over these documents.
Why don't you say Ben and join Clark so you're two against one?
Okay,
So,
yeah.
a lot of the historical films I made, the people are no longer living. You know, there's nobody I could interview for Lincoln. But in this case, a little bit like Bridge of Spies, there were descendants. There were people who were part of that extraordinary time in 1971, and we benefited from it. We benefited from getting to know Don Graham and his son Will. We benefited by getting to know Lolly Weymouth and Daniel Ellsberg and principals of that era who changed the course of history.
For me, this movie, it tells the story of the Pentagon Papers. It tells the story of Kay Graham and Ben Bradley's relationship. It tells the story of Kay Graham. But the thing that holds it all together are these relationships and these characters and the really true dynamic that these people had with each other.
No matter what happens tomorrow, we are not a little local paper anymore.
It's been really amazing to see the two of them. I mean, I knew from the beginning Meryl was going to know more about Kay than I did, right? Because she was starting roughly the same time as I was, and she's brilliant. And, you know, I think she's read and seen more. And similarly with Tom, he knew Ben a little bit, you know, and Stephen knew Ben quite well, which I think is very useful.
I cannot imagine anybody else playing Katharine Graham. The way Meryl Streep acquitted the nature of her character and plumbed the depths of her life in under 2 hours. I don't know how Meryl did it, and I'm the director.
We had a lot of archival material to draw upon to look at how to present Katharine Graham. Katharine Graham was very, very tall. That's one thing that gave her a sort of patrician grace and a bearing that was intimidating to some people, even as self-conscious as she was. She presented in a certain way that was distinct and important, so we worked hard to try to get that. But it wasn't as important to try to look like her as it was to capture something of her personal grace.
Thank you, Arthur, for your frankness.
There was a tentativeness backstage to her decisions, and then in meetings and things she would try to present in a very different way. That was an interesting challenge.
My husband, Tracy Letts, said in a speech when he had the privilege of giving Meryl an award one evening, and he said, "The mistake we make about somebody like Meryl is assuming that she's somehow magical. In fact, what Meryl Streep is an incredibly hard worker."
There's not a moment in which she is not reacting to you. She is bouncing off of everything that you give her, and she's trying to find the moment along with you. And in that way, you cannot do wrong. And that, well, man, that's the high country, man, when you're working with somebody like that. Why is he talking to you?
Well, I just told you he's my friend.
Oh, is he talking to any other friends?
This is the 5th film Tom and I made as an actor-director partnership. And Tom continues to surprise me every time we work together. It's kind of like I didn't know he had this character in him. We got 10 hours till deadline. Dig in.
All right, that's it. We got 10 hours to do it. Let's dig in.
Let's dig in.
Right.
Dig in.
There's a lot of information on Ben Bradley, not the least of which comes from his autobiography himself. Luckily, there's tons of film on Ben. He gave an awful lot of interviews because after Watergate, he became a much sought-after guy in order to talk about that era. There's millions of people who worked with him that I was able to talk to, and also Sally Quinn, his wife. She and I had a number of great conversations.
Sally said, you know, Ben had this phrase, he loved to say, "My God, the fun," which was the essence of his personality as an editor. The fact that he could be a hard-hitting journalist and editor and still be able to stop in the middle of a story and say,
My God, the fun.
And another favorite word Sally said of Ben's was retromingent, which we got a chance to use one time.
Not true. I give one rat's ass.
Yeah.
One retromingent rat's ass.
I think it means an animal that can only piss backwards.
I understand you did a big close-up of me, looking at Meryl off camera. That's the one sheet? That's right. With the new title, What You Gonna Do, Kay?
My greatest appreciation of Tom started before we were shooting, because all the reporters 7 or 8 of us, I think, all got together at his place in New York. He had this big lunch, and we all read it, and we got to know each other, and he sort of spearheaded that. That was his thing.
It ends up being a good thing because then, months hence, when we're showing up to work on the first day, we actually know each other in the hair and makeup trailer, or we're not introducing each other trying to find it on the set.
Save it for the afternoon. I need Chow and Judith.
Judith!
There are a lot of characters, and it's also very timely. So I think everybody felt very passionately about this story being told right now.
Ellen Lewis, who had done Bridge of Spies with us, she came on and she cast the movie, and she just did an excellent job. We got every cast member we wanted.
All my first choices were available, and the few that weren't, we worked out the dates with the producers on the projects they were currently engaged with, and so it all sort of fell into place.
This is probably the most unusual film that we've made, for various reasons. Primarily, I would say that the amount of actors that had tremendous significance every time they spoke.
And action.
Mr. Bagdickian.
When I am casting real people, what I am looking for is an essence of the person. I'm not looking to cast lookalikes.
I need to know your source.
I think now with cable and the amount of programming that is available, it has opened the floodgates for actors, one, to work a lot more, which is great, but also for us to now be watching television to see what actors we're seeing on television that we can use in films.
Why don't you cut your bangs?
Mommy,
A little bit.
I'm right in the middle. It certainly feels like a great responsibility to play a real person. For me, it was very important to do a lot of research, and I watched a lot of videos of Lally and read articles and interviews that she had done. And I did some vocal coaching for the role. Stephen had mentioned that we should change our voices a little, and Kay Graham certainly had a very specific way of speaking, and I think we wanted to approximate Lally and also just to sound like we were in the same family.
I jumped on Air Force One, spent the weekend.
I did not jump. You and Louis Pearson said I had to
speedboating
go.
with Lyndon and Lady Bird.
Kay's in a position she never thought she'd be in.
I was playing a real person, and there were only photographic images. Some of it had to be invented, and in that sense, it was very freeing because I didn't have to worry about matching a voice. I didn't have to worry about matching a physical cadence. And it is an enormous responsibility because, you know, this woman's got children and she's not alive anymore, but people who knew her are, and you never want people to think it's terrible or inaccurate, you know, but you do the best you can with what you have.
There's an article about me coming out in the Times tomorrow. It's not flattering. It's a tiny little moment in McNamara's life, and he was a huge, huge character.
We're here.
That's after the joke, right?
Exactly.
I can come to you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right after the joke, everybody.
He was a force of nature who could not make a decision. He would rather make a bad decision than wait and make no decision. And he ran afoul of that sort of mindset more than twice in his life.
We felt that military pressure was the only thing that was going to drive Ho Chi Minh to the table. Our decision-making process was
flawed.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
David Cross and I had a TV show on HBO called Mr. Show, and then a show called With Bob and David. So it was a sketch comedy show, and there was no awareness when we were hired that we were a comedy duo. We didn't want to say anything at first. It was like, don't tell him, don't tell him. But Stephen kept saying, Bob and David, you guys stand next to each other.
And it happened 4 times in a row, to the point where Bob and I would look at each other and go, this is gonna be, does he know?
We weren't sure how he would feel about discovering that he'd cast this comedy team in his serious movie.
That was one of the first questions we asked when everything was kind of over and settled. And he said he didn't know about it, but then somebody told him about it. I think it might have been Tom Hanks. It was like, you know about Mr. Show? You know those guys did a whole thing together, back in the day, So that was cool. But he was totally cool about it.
We know your reporters are talented, but the New York Times spent 3 months going over these documents.
I had worked with Zach Woods before. He actually played my ex-boyfriend in something, so then now in this we play partners. So I hung out with him quite a bit, but when you're waiting around, you're all just kind of there. So when you're surrounded by such talented people, Then to top it all off, nice people that you want to sit in a room with all day. So it just makes your job so easy.
If the public ever saw these papers, they would turn against the war.
Meeting Ellsberg was incredible. A big question I had for him was, during this time, you know, had the largest FBI manhunt after him. I said, were you scared? And he said, no, I wasn't, because I had such conviction in what I was doing. And that to me was a real key into who he was.
They're gonna lock you up, Dan.
Wouldn't you go to prison to stop this war?
I do see you after, you know, but a woman in charge, then you should keep talking.
Yeah, it's not like it's an easy sell. It's not
exactly right.
A local paper. Yeah.
Perfect.
The buyers are obviously skittish about having a woman in charge, and it's not like it's an easy sell. It's a local.
Arthur Parsons is one of the few people in this movie who did not exist in real life. He's a kind of amalgamation of several characters functioning as kind of an antagonist.
They think it's possible, likely even, that a number of the institutional investors will pull out if you choose to publish.
My character needs to be the strongest obstacle you can be in sort of avoiding mustache twirling. If I'm a dismissible jerk, it diminishes the heroicism of what Ben Bradley and what Kay Graham are doing. So that is my struggle as an actor.
Can you guarantee me that we could go to print without endangering any of our soldiers?
You can't be considering going.
I'm talking to Mr. Bradley now.
I live in New York, so I'm also always going to the theater, always looking for interesting people.
I get a lot of my cast from theater. A lot of Lincoln was cast right off the boards, as were many roles in the Post.
The company selling how many shares?
Like Tracy Letts, the Pulitzer Prize-winning, Tony-winning author, playwright.
Steven took a lot of terrific theater actors, people who have worked in film as well, but people who have spent a lot of time on stages here in New York, and I had several old Chicago pals in this movie as well. And that's great fun for me. Some faces I've known for 30 years, some people were brand new to me, but there was really a sense from the earliest days that people were cheering for each other.
I didn't crash Julie's wedding.
What would you call it, Judith?
Well, I would call it deft reportage.
All right, come on, everybody.
This is my first movie, my first film. I still can't believe it. I feel like I got the golden ticket. I didn't know what to expect. It was just like a joyful place to be every day. Everybody was so glad to be there and to be a part of it.
To play someone who is a real person and who's living today and who will watch this movie, there is a great responsibility to that. So what I decided to do was pull his articles from when he was working in the paper the year that this takes place, because I wanted to understand his interests and the things he wrote about. It's important to me to make it as real as possible. So I took one of those articles that he wrote, I printed it out, and I transcribed it onto a notepad. And then I stuck that notepad on my desk, and there's a scene where I'm typing an article.
Everyone, listen up!
And instead of just typing nonsense, I'm typing an article that he really wrote that week. And that, to me, it just makes it all the more real.
We think editorial should run something.
I just heard somebody say they're working on that.
Well, if the White House is going to take a stance like that, don't you think we should plant a flag? The woman I play is named Meg Greenfield. She's at this time working on the editorial board at the Washington Post. And like Katharine Graham, she's one of the only women working in this capacity in the United States. And so it's interesting for me because I play one of two women in this newsroom who, much like Katharine Graham, they don't fit in the boardroom with the boys, but they're also hierarchically have more authority than the secretaries. And there are no other women in the room otherwise. And so one of the things I love about this story that I discovered is that Meg Greenfield and Katharine Graham, of course, became very good friends, as you must have allies in situations like this. It's a real fish out of water story, ultimately.
If you're nervous and need distraction, I do happen to have a copy of today's Time.
Abe?
During my research on Abe, I had found one particular anecdote that he seemed to put across in all of his interviews. He says, you know what the power of the New York Times is that when anybody from Boston to Washington calls anybody else from Boston to Washington, the unspoken assumption of their conversation is that they both started the morning reading the New York Times. And I just thought it kind of encapsulated who he was, how he really was the Times at that time.
Must be a lot of people from Boston to Washington reading about us. Yes, Well, I suppose it's appropriate, given what's at stake.
Listen up! We've got a decision. We've got a decision.
There's a reason that all these people are here right now together making this movie in 2017. It has to do with the importance of the First Amendment and of having this discussion about the First Amendment.
The Founding Fathers gave the free press the protection it must have to fulfill its essential role in our democracy.
It's really essential. It's what makes us American. It defines us. And every single person that I know of who has participated in this process is here for that reason, first and foremost.
The press was to serve the governed, not the governors.
Okay, Broder's got Nixon working on a second term. Osnos has something on GIs buying heroin in Saigon. But Ryder's got a rocket on the FBI list of potential subversives.
The movie takes place in 1971, and we had to figure out how to make Washington, D.C. look like it looked in 1971. And so we had to enlist Rick Carter, we enlisted Ann Roth, Deb Jensen, who was our art director, Kim Jennings, who was another art director, Rena D'Angelo, who was our set decorator, and just immersed ourselves into the period.
Is anybody else tired of reading the news instead of reporting it? Do we have any leads?
There's a guy, Phil, and I know in Boston who worked at Defense when McNamara commissioned the study.
All right, call him.
For me, I'm old enough that I was draft age in the late 1960s. So I was very aware of what was going on at the time in terms of at least the information that I was getting about what the war in Vietnam was based upon. So I was aware in 1971 when the Pentagon Papers came out. I actually was very much aware of this era, and so to recreate it now for me is really like a flashback. Steven sent me the script to read and said we have to be shooting this in less than 10 weeks. So I came to New York and got a great crew together. And one of the things we had to do right away was find out how to do the interior of the Washington Post newsroom. Finding a location became the imperative. So we actually found a location in White Plains, New York, and here we are. This is the actual set that we built within the location. Also, when you go outside of here, certain locations from certain angles look a little like Washington, D.C., but not the Washington, D.C. that's the monuments that we all are used to seeing, like, oh, there's the Washington Monument, there's the Capitol. It's much more of what I call the federal brutalist architecture, that kind of FBI, bureaucracy-laden architecture that's very, very much about rectangles and squares and straight lines. So we're using that as our Washington, D.C. motif. Welcome to the Washington Post newsroom. This is what's known as the bullpen of the Washington Post in the era of 1971, an era, as you can look and see, that has no computers. There were no computers anywhere to be seen, so we all worked on typewriters back in those days.
Rick Carter created the actual Washington Post newsroom the way it actually was in 1971. I couldn't believe it. And then a friend of mine who still works for the Washington Post, Richard Cohen, I invited him to the set to come watch us shoot, and he shows up on the set, walks onto the news floor, and he looked around and his eyes filled with tears. And he said, "This is the place. This is the place where I worked."
This way is Ben Bradley's office. As you can see from this position behind his desk, he could look out and see his entire world, all the reporters who worked with him to bring out the stories, and this is all based upon actual documented photos of his office.
Here we go, let's start by the shoot.
It was very much of an out-of-body experience when all those extras come in looking like 1970s reporters, and to be reminded of what that newsroom felt like, all the cigarette smoke. So much has changed, even in our old-fashioned profession in the years since.
And you can take a look at all the details that our set decorator Rena D'Angelo has put, as you can see, in a way that you would never see today. Many cigarettes, phones that have only a few extensions. Everything's by hand. It's almost as if people just vanished for a moment and it's just us in this newsroom.
It's not the newsroom that you would have seen a year later during the Watergate period and All the President's Men, because that was the new newsroom that was built after the Pentagon Papers. Originally, it was a small newsroom, a fraction of the size of what it became over the years.
It's quite a hubbub when you actually see everybody filled in this set and they're all in period costumes. One of the things that we have in this set that I really like is because it's a real location that we built within it, we've got a lot more depth than we normally would.
I like the fact that this set accurately shows that this was the pre-modern era. So even though the reporters were starting to be more modern, they were still using typewriters and sending copy up through pneumatic tubes and editing with pen, and the desks were metal. And so I just love the fact that the set shows this transitional time of journalism.
We spent a big chunk of time on that newspaper's office floor. It's really tough because it is by nature brightly lit, top-lit environment. So I lit it very simply. It was very challenging, but at the same time, it was great to be able to point the camera any direction you wanted to.
I tried them all. I was going around and around and around. I don't know if they had that as eclectic a mix of typewriters, but maybe they did. I don't know if the reporter brought in their own. This carriage, that's for a writer. When you get into the width of this size, that's more people, bookkeepers, spreadsheets, things like that, because they'd have longer ledger entries that they make. So what you want is a true writer's desktop. And the sound is fantastic. You know, newsrooms don't sound that way anymore. When they were doing room tone, or actually like rehearsing, or we were trying to get an essence of what it is, and everybody was typing, oh, it's a gorgeous white noise in the background.
While we did the research on 1971 in the Washington Post, we found so many things that we could incorporate into our story. You know, the memo pads, Ben Bradley, Kay Graham had them. We went very, very deep.
Everybody that we met that worked at the Post at the time said, I don't remember color. I don't think it was colorful. So we went in the direction of gray, and I made it completely monochromatic and just let the people stand out with little pops of color here and there. I walked into an office furniture place, and I wound up getting 40 desks from them, and then I got another 50 from somebody else. I know where all the desks and filing cabinets in the country are now.
It was great. I'm born in 1965. The movies I grew up watching, right, were set in that time period. Of course, we all know and love All the President's Men, such a seminal and important film. And so to set foot on a set like that and to be in that world, to immerse yourself in that world, just great fun.
That gave you the chills, because it's like standing in another time. All of it adds to the momentum of the film. It was very, very exciting.
I can't describe how much easier it makes one's job when everything in front of you felt so authentic that it was like you stepped out of a time machine. That's a real testament to the level of care and detail that's gone into making this extraordinary set.
You could just walk around that room and read all these letters from Ben Bradley to the editors of the Washington Post, newspapers of that time, magazines of that time. It was great fun to wander through that and check it all out.
I hung around there a lot. I took naps on people's couches, and they said, oh, you're not in this shot. I said, well, what am I going to do? I mean, I'm going to stay here like Ben Bradley did. So I read, and I did some writing, and I would get together with the other people who weren't working, and we would talk or rehearse other scenes. That set was the full magic in the Magic Factory, and that it's as deep as it is and goes as far as it does. It ends up being part of the time machine that movies can be.
This is Katharine Graham's office in the executive suite. This is where she had her office and all of her memorabilia. And we have a lot of this documented from a 60 Minutes episode that they did with Mike Wallace. Was in an office like this.
Katharine Graham was more closed off. She was upstairs on the executive floor. She was with the boardroom. She was with all of the lawyers and the business people. And her office is more masculine in keeping with what the Washington Post was. It's not her taste in there. It was very wooden, very straight lines, and then she had her pictures behind her desk and some flowers to bring in a little bit of her. I added some curtains to the windows instead of just having blinds like everywhere else. I think her personality came through, but it was just a tiny little piece of it.
Read just like you're talking to yourself, you're reading the passage.
The director inserts so many of the props that we've created for the movie. They actually are characters. The first character prop would be the Xerox machine, and that Xerox machine was very specific and was a Xerox 9 914, and we found one at the Xerox Museum up in Rochester, and they were kind enough to lend it to us. But even when that machine was in use, it used to catch on fire, so they told us we were not allowed to plug it in. So we had to rig the light on the machine and also the action for the paper coming out, because we couldn't actually plug this machine in, but it was spectacular.
Covert ops, guaranteed debt, rigged elections, it's all in there.
And of course, the Pentagon Papers themselves, the star of the movie. There were 44 volumes of the Pentagon Papers, 7,700 pages. You can look at pictures, but you don't really know what the texture is. You don't know how they felt. And so much has to happen when you see the real thing. So I went down to the National Archives and was actually able to look at all of the Pentagon Papers and handle them and sort of get a feel for the paper and what holds them together. And all of that was historically correct.
Well, at least we got the wedding.
And of course, the newspapers, the most important element of our show. We probably created 30 different newspapers, myself and Eddie Iafreda, fantastic graphic designer. He and I, we tirelessly went and found all the copies of all of the papers that we needed, all the days from the New York Times and all the days from the Washington Post and then some of the other papers. And we were so lucky because I found a barn in the middle of the country that had archived most of the New York Times for the month of June 1971. So I got actual newspapers for a lot of these. And the rest of them we were able to get online. And we recreated them to the sizes and then had them all printed. And also because they were going to be reading them, several of these newspapers, we did all of the interior pages. Many of these papers play a big part of many of the scenes in the movie.
Sorry to barge in again.
Maybe I should give you a key.
At Steiner Studios in Brooklyn, we have our two stage sets, Kay Graham's house and Ben Bradley's house, the interiors. We've crammed them into 2 stages, so we're gonna see how they lived.
For Katharine Graham's house, we based it on her actual house that we surveyed. So we built it to scale, pretty much, what we could fit on the stage. And then I had some photos of what a real house looked like in later years, 90-something, and some from 60s. And then I sort of took liberties with color and fabric. I wanted it to be warm, elegant, and have a little bit of her character. I didn't want her to feel inaccessible. I think it's opulent, but I don't think it's over the top.
I feel like we just drove out to Georgetown.
Bradley's house, I spoke with his children and his wife after, Tony, Sally, and she gave me a lot of insight. He was friends with the Kennedys. I researched what their houses looked like. He came from money, but he wasn't ostentatious, and I know that they had children in the house, and it was comfortable, and the wife was a bohemian, so I mixed traditional furniture with a little bit of bohemian flair, and I think it came out fantastic.
Again, my friend. You always come through.
Steven was saying how much depth he found in the newsroom and the settings that we have for the movie. And I joked with him, well, I thought it was verbal Private Ryan.
I think you might want to focus more on what women...
Catherine, keep your finger out of my eye.
Meaning that this is actually an action movie. It's a war movie. But it actually, instead of being a broad canvas in terms of how many exteriors we have, it goes deeper and deeper and deeper in through this personal journey of Kay finding her voice and Ben as well finding his role in all of this, and see that it does matter in the world. The linotype process is like looking into the insides of a film camera, where you see all the moving parts. You see how much work goes into every newspaper pre-1980 that was created in this amazingly mechanical way that somehow developed into something that you could rely on to have paper at your doorstep in this era. Fortunately, there is a linotype machine almost next door to where we're filming at Steiner Studios.
I had no idea that the linotype printing machine was as confusing an apparatus as it was. And it was hot lead. You realize these lead ingots are literally melted and spit through this thing that throws it onto a plate. It seems so primitive and so archaic. It made me wonder how they even got newspapers made.
The linotype machine, I think, certainly was a modern miracle. It is a glorious antiquity, and we were able to really bring that back to life.
But the bigger press scenes that you will see with the papers rolling off the presses and all that you're used to seeing from old movies, that will be happening at the New York Post in the Bronx.
That was certainly a unique experience. It was my first time seeing the printing presses in person. I was astonished by how massive they were. I couldn't believe how many different pieces of machines are used. It's almost like jazz. I mean, the way all these machines work into the next thing to create one paper.
The printing presses were an incredibly physical process of the newsprint and how fast it went. I was intimidated by it. When I was a kid, I just read the newspaper without knowing nearly the amount of work that went into that 3:30 Oakland Tribune that I helped the pal deliver. It's astounding.
Right, guys, we're lining up.
The best people in the world were doing our makeup designs and our hair, and Nan Roth with the costumes. Together, it's magical. Even myself as Ben, I look different from Ben. I sound different from Ben. I have a different type of body than Ben did. And I assumed that Meryl had the same limitations, but not what you walked onto the set, man. That was Kay Graham, pure and simple. Kay Graham.
Anne Roth is just a genius designer. I've worked with her, I can't even think how many films, all the way back to Karen Silkwood. And of course, she designed Midnight Cowboy and Clute and just amazing, amazing films.
The day that Tom and then Meryl walked into the newsroom, jaws dropped. It was astonishing.
We are ready here. No food and drink on set.
Oh, Anne Roth was a riot from my first fitting. You stand there. Don't talk back. I don't think I've ever been clad by somebody who is more into detail and still loves it.
I knew that the most important thing for me walking into a fitting is to stay open to whatever Anne Roth has to teach me, because inevitably somebody with her skill and her incredible preparation is someone who's got something to teach you about the person you're playing. And of course, as soon as I walked in, there's a rack full of clothing, and all of it was completely spot on and appropriate for Meg.
I bet you any actor who's ever worked with her will tell you that, because she has this special quality where she's actually interested from an acting standpoint how you're going to use your clothes. I know actors who have found their characters in fittings with Anne Roth.
You've taken this and you designed this based on this. That's what I love about it.
She is a craftsman of the highest degree. She plays with the actor, with wardrobe, with accessories, earrings, necklaces, boots, socks. She just wants the actor to disappear into the character. And when the actor no longer sees themselves, they see their character. That's when she knows she's created something.
And cut, next shot. Great. Great.
Steven, at this point, he has a lot of trust. Certainly showed him photographs, some sketches along the way, but he came into this environment as it was mostly dressed. What I try to design for him is a back lot where everywhere he looks, he can be in the world that he's in. And he had a total immersive experience that he always likes to have.
You know what my husband said about the news. He called it the first rough draft of history. That's good, isn't it?
I was minding my own business, making Ready Player One, with no intention of doing anything until Ready Player One was in theaters, when I was given a script called The Post by Liz Hannah. And I put off reading it because I just didn't need the temptation. But I read it on a weekend, and I remember going, oh, I'm doomed. This is, oh no, this is not good for me. The premise and the critical study and the beautiful personal portrait of Katharine Graham that Liz rendered in her draft was enough to get me to say, I might be crazy, but I think I'm gonna make a movie right now. Tom, you should be there. That's great. And then I can pan up to Tom like this. That's great. That's like that. That's very good.
This has been a very surreal experience from the very beginning. We sat down with Liz Hannah in 2014, maybe, 2015. We were a big fan of her writing, and we thought we'd love to find a project to do with you. And she had said that she was a big fan of Katharine Graham, and she had read the book Personal History.
About 6 or 7 years ago, I read Kay's memoir, and I kind of became obsessed with her, and I just couldn't get her out of my head. I kept thinking about her and thinking about, well, what is this movie? And it didn't really occur to me that it was this point in her life until I read Ben Bradley's memoir.
Can I ask you a hypothetical question?
Oh dear, I don't like hypothetical questions.
Well, I don't think you're gonna like the real one either.
Do you have the papers?
Not yet.
And I realized that this was the story of the two of them, that the decision to publish the Pentagon Papers was really the moment in her life where she chose to be the person she was going to be.
I have a really great executive who works for me named Ben, and he's very aggressively tracking things around town. And he came across this script that had gone out by Liz, and Ben enterprisingly got a copy of it, gave it to me on a Friday afternoon, and by Friday at midnight, I owned it. Steven called me, it was around the weekend of the Academy Awards, to tell me he'd read the script and he was thinking about it.
Just rehearse those two lines right now when you say one.
Myself and Meryl and Steven read it all about the same time. And I said, well, if he's going to do it, I'd love to be involved in this. And I read it and counted it up, the scenes I had with Meryl. How many do I have with Meryl? How many times am I going to get to have that opportunity? We read this in February or March, and our first day of shooting was the 1st of May. That's very fast for a movie to come together. And it doesn't happen unless Steven jumps.
So from a script that perhaps people might be interested in, it became something that was going to happen. It was going to happen in the next 3 weeks, and get ready. So I did all my research that I possibly could. They also brought on Josh Singer, who wrote Spotlight, wonderful, wonderful screenplay writer, and he and Liz enhanced it, and the script became even richer and even more compelling.
I had known Josh because he had done a couple of films for my company, and I sent the material to Josh, and he really responded to Liz's script. And we got very fired up about the possibilities of where the story could go.
Liz's draft was a great roadmap and was really an incredible spec. I've never seen anything like it, really. So for me, a lot of what I was trying to do was actually track the history, because the history of events in these 2 weeks is breathtaking. And then just expand the world, right? Get a feeling for the larger world that is around these people.
So it all sort of fell into place, as if this project in 2017 was kind of meant to happen.
We've got really amazing characters, great dialogue, and a very compelling story, but it took someone like Steven, who there's only one of out there, to really turn it into this cinematic, kind of very epic film.
I am going to just ask Mr. Hanks to give us just a little send-off at the beginning of this movie. I usually customarily do it, and I would like this time to defer to Mr. Bradley.
All right. All motion pictures are documents somehow. They're historical documents that go down as of the record of how we lived and how we thought about our times. Never has there been a period picture that has been more tied into the actual events of the day than our little enterprise right now. So, a toast to filmmaking and a toast to telling the truth as much as possible. God bless.
Let's use this Steadicam for one piece. Okay. Yeah. Let's use this Steadicam for this one.
All these actors were absolutely panicked because this was one of those movies where you couldn't pretend it wasn't a big deal. You're looking at a call sheet going, it's Meryl Streep and it's Tom Hanks and it's this one, it's that one, it's Steven Spielberg and Janusz and all these incredible people in every department. And it was impossible not to feel apoplectic about the whole thing. And I know everyone felt this way. And so that was sort of comforting. A camaraderie on set was everyone was talking about how much they had been awake the night before.
Who's terrified? Who? We're all terrified. Petrified. Scared out of our minds.
The first scene I did was the scene where I had lines with a bunch of the guys.
Didn't you crash the wedding of Nixon's other daughter to get a story?
Well, I did get a story, but I didn't crash Julie's wedding. There was so much going on in that scene that I didn't have enough time to be nervous about it. I just had to concentrate and make sure I was saying my lines, and everybody was so kind and just kind of guided me along.
My first day on set was the day before we started shooting, and it was a day of camera tests for Meryl and for Tom. And I had to come in to take some photos, and Steven said really lovely things. And then Meryl took my face in her hands and said, "Look at you, you handsome thing," and gave me a motherly hug, and we talked about how we resembled each other. And now a day at work is just a regular day. I still have moments where I'm realizing who I'm talking to. But the fact that it feels so normal is a real testament to the work that they do to make you feel normal and allow you to thrive in that environment.
My very first day was a scene with just Meryl and I. She and I are in the living room, and I'm just giving her a real hard time. So it's a really fun scene. It's a really wordy scene and a very fast-paced scene. I certainly felt incredibly nervous. And then Meryl Streep walks on set, and she's just so wonderful. Any anxieties I had evaporated immediately because I thought, oh, good. I can just listen and react to Meryl. As long as I'm present and just in the scene with her, it's gonna go okay.
And just sitting there in the makeup trailer on the first day, and they were tweaking my wig or something, crack of dawn, and I'm chatting away to the makeup artist. Tom jumps out of his chair and goes, Bruce, hey man, great to have you here. And just immense, just a very open, energetic, nice guy.
I just want to thank you all for coming out this evening. I had a voiceover part in AI, and that was not as satisfying. This experience, this was the real deal, because I always admired his films, but I was never asked to dance before, and so I was just thrilled that he was gonna direct this.
That's great, right? That's great.
I was completely unprepared for how free he is as a filmmaker. He's so in command of his art that it's just, I won't say it's effortless because he works very hard, but we came in there, no rehearsal. That really shocked me. You just go in and start shooting. And then he'll just mix everything up. He says, no, I'm gonna do something different here. We're just gonna toss this up and start in a different place. And it was just so spontaneous, really thrilling.
That was great. That was really, really good. Really fun. One more time. I didn't force the film into a pre-order. I didn't have a plan or a vision. In terms of where I put the camera, I kind of played it by ear, which was really fun for me when I could do that, because so many other movies I do storyboards and I get very involved in pre-visualizations. And I just made a very, very complicated special effects picture. And suddenly I felt that I was free again.
I dropped by when I wasn't working and I could have a peek at the monitor. And there's a scene where Ellsberg is in his hotel room and Bagdikian has just gone up there to grab the boxes of papers. And there was a shot where you can see Ellsberg underneath his arm.
He would say to us, let the chips fall where they may.
When you stand back and you watch him set those shots up, you go, wow, that's beautiful.
You don't see them at all, and then this continues blocking them, but then you see them here. I did this shot in 1980 on Raiders of the Lost Ark. Josh pointed it out.
The thing that's extraordinary about Steven and filmmakers from his generation is that they're one of the last generations that's really cutting in the camera. They were educated in the medium of film, and so he's incredibly efficient because he knows exactly what he needs. And we actually don't do that many takes, which is something I was really surprised and impressed by.
He's incredibly funny and incredibly inquisitive, just asking me a million questions, everything from like our favorite flavor of jelly bean to world peace, which is why I think his movies are so wonderful, because they're filled with such nuanced detail about human behavior, which is what I think impacts you most as a viewer, is when you see yourself up there in some way.
Working with Steven, there are more than your fair share of goosebump moments. And they come from everything from when he says that was a nice line, to just watching him work and seeing the innovation, the improvisation. I've never seen anything like it. He will connect ideas with the camera. I mean, he had this idea of you're behind Kay Graham, and there's this one long tracking shot that will tell the story of the whole movie from her point of view.
How are you, Kay?
Everyone.
He's always making things bolder, and so watching that has just been extraordinary.
Next shot, that was great.
He's a great regulator of the tempo and the timbre of a scene. He will ignore moments that you think are important and come in specifically on moments that you didn't even see as being all that necessary, because he's looking at some other aspect of the scene. He would come up to me and he would ask for a little more voice. He would ask for some other kind of specifics, but he would also then periodically come by and say, don't be so sure of yourself. I said, wow, I love that. Not so sure. Or other times say, don't say anything, just watch and observe. And a lot of times that's the antithesis of what actors want to do, the perfection of what can be screen acting, because then you're just being as opposed to pontificating.
I think the only way this is going to work is if we start shooting it until we like it. I just find making movies to be kind of a team collaborative effort. It's not an autocracy. It really is gathering the best ideas together to tell the best type of story. And I had the most amazing collaborators on this one.
There's dozens of stories in here. The Times has barely scratched the surface. We have 10 hours till the deadline, so we dig in.
One of the things that I think is the strongest about this film is the beauty of it, because it's a film that takes place in offices and at dinner parties. And how to make that interesting is what Janusz has brought. How to make that compelling and, in a way, propulsive, to make the story so you can't wait to see what happens next. I think that's Steven, obviously. But together they work seamlessly, those two. They see with the same pair of eyes.
The center is sharp. Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, we got the good one. If we don't like it, it's too much, then we can just... And he's not at the step. When he goes forward, it's going to get slightly less.
Steven and myself, we prefer the traditional way of making movies. Traditional way meaning using 35mm cameras and using regular lights and using 35mm film stock.
Why don't we do this? Why don't we have Buzz turn on the paper?
For me, my aim was through my photography not go towards the 70s because I felt the story feels so relevant that if you splatter all that 1970 time frame on the picture, the movie may not be relevant. And so consequently, I was using a lighting style that normally I wouldn't use for a movie that takes place in such a period. And aiming to achieve some sense of reality through the lighting, through the composition, and through the world that we've created, a reality that is relevant to what's happening right now.
This movie is about reflecting back on our history, and Janusz and Steven together figured out how they would show reflections in the newsroom and reflections of Ben Bagdikian's character in the payphone when he goes to make that phone call. And I think those things really helped us tell our story in a better way.
I grew up in Poland, and we were fascinated by American cinema of 1970s. So I was very familiar with that vocabulary. There are scenes that I played a little bit of homage towards that style of filmmaking. And there's one particular scene where Bobby's on the phone, and we just brought the camera a little bit further away from him. There's a very brutalistic architecture around him, so it was just so instinctual and so natural to just go that direction and make it very graphic with lines of the buildings crossing the frame and putting a 1970 police car driving through the frame and not using lights, just using natural light for that particular scene. A little bit of a homage to the movies that I love so much.
Ben, there are concerns here that are frankly above your pay grade.
And then there's one particular shot for Meryl when she's on the phone using the descender rig, where the camera starts high up in the air, looking down at Meryl as she's listening and having conversation on the telephone, and the camera descends and rotates around her several times.
It's a big monitor in my hand.
Okay. But yet again, when you see the movie, you don't have the sense that it's a gimmicky shot. It just feels appropriate for the drama of the scene.
On one of the days we were working, there was a cake waiting for us on set. One of the PAs standing there said, "Hey, do you want some cake for Kay's birthday?" And I thought they meant Meryl, because a lot of times we are called by our characters' names. Well, it wasn't Meryl's birthday, it was Kay Graham's 100th birthday.
Katharine Graham, had she lived, would have turned 100 during the production of the film. So we had this huge birthday cake of the Washington Post, of the paper on the cake. And Will Graham came to represent the family. We are so appreciative of having the privilege to actually be here to recreate a very significant part of your grandmom's life.
In addition to cake, we also each got a complimentary subscription to the Washington Post. But what's most important about this gift is the message and the spirit in which it was given. To love what you do and feel that it matters, how could anything be more fun? Katharine Graham said this about her newsroom. I could just as easily say it about making this film. Here's to Kay on her 100th birthday. And here's to you for being here to celebrate it. Thank you, Steven. This really just summarizes the spirit with which Steven Spielberg moves through the world, and I can't think of a more appropriate person to celebrate this extraordinary woman. And we were all very lucky to be there on this day and to be here to make this film.
Gentlemen, thank you all for helping make the Washington Post a more robust company.
For me, Steven has always had very strong women in his movies. Obviously, Kate in Indiana Jones and Temple of Doom, Marion Ravenwood in Raiders of the Lost Ark, Dee Wallace in E.T., Gertie in E.T., The Color Purple, and now with this story, Katharine Graham. It's pretty remarkable.
Frankly, they're concerned about your ability to turn a serious profit.
There's a scene in the movie that every woman who's ever been in a meeting in their life just died over. And that is that you're sitting in the board meeting, you have all the information, you can't open your mouth. And when you do, it's as though no one sees you. People talk right over you. You give the answer. No one hears you. Someone else says it. They hear them. And believe me, I ran a company pretty recently, and it was exactly the same. And they all worked for me. Kay talks about that a lot in her book, how people would look right through her. And for a long time, she didn't think anything of it. Once you take a stand in life, you face yourself. You become something. She became something that day.
This is no longer my father's company. It's no longer my husband's company. It's my company.
On my last day, we had an opportunity to celebrate all the women working on this movie. They had us all get together and take a photo with all the women working in every capacity on the film, the crew, producers, actors. It was really cool because there were so many.
We realized that there were more women than men on the set, which I think this is the first time that that's ever happened on a movie that I've worked on. We felt Katharine Graham's spirit at work in getting all of us to work together.
I love being surrounded on the set every single day by Amy Pascal, our great producer, Chrissy McCosco, our great producer, Liz Hanna, who was on the set at least half the time supporting us, and this whole great company of actresses. I mean, it was really fun.
We were shooting the Supreme Court coming down with their decision to allow the newspapers to print the Pentagon Papers. So all the reporters were there, all the front office people, Meryl, Tom. It was a fairly large group of this cast back together again. At Columbia University, doubling for the Supreme Court.
There were protests happening, and there must have been 200 extras or something, and just the attention to detail was incredible.
There's a way in order to have the last day of a movie, and that's about as good as you get. Ton of extras, magical setting. Somebody else is doing all the work. All we really had to do was sit there, you listen. And even there, Steven found something that was brand new, that wasn't in the screenplay. He concentrated women on this one little path, and Kay Graham walks down through that path, and every one of the women had their eyes directly on her, because at the end of this story, it's about her. It's not even about what happened inside, it's about something else. A perfect final day on what I think was about as perfect a movie-making experience as I've ever had.
This has been the greatest ensemble experience of my entire life. I have never had an ensemble cast like this, under one roof, between four walls. I don't finish, and the crew doesn't finish until Sunday at like 3 a.m. However, this is the last shot on all of you. Meryl, my God, I've been trying to work with you for all my life. Thank you, and God bless all of you for sharing this experience with me.
Wow. To the king. To the gov. To the gov.
Everyone was just kind of looking around like, did he just say that? Just felt extremely special, and I think everyone was just proud to have made him proud, you know.
I was not alone in being really moved by Steven's generosity and warmth and celebration of this project. It was really a powerful and wonderful experience.
Who's the long hair? That's Ellsberg. Works for Lansdale at the embassy. He's observing.
When we were trying to just learn more about the Pentagon Papers, Steven invited me to a meeting with Daniel Ellsberg and his wife. And that's where I heard for the first time that he was in fact a Marine, and he had gone to Vietnam many, many times.
With the research, you're constantly going through pictures and reading material. The sequence in Vietnam is based all on meticulous truth. There was a firefight that Ellsberg got caught up in because he became this strange character in the Vietnam War. He was meant to be witness, he was meant to report on the war. But then he was out on patrol, they armed him, and he wasn't a legitimate soldier, he was a former Marine. So he became this strange entity in the Vietnam War where he was taking pictures and engaging the enemy himself.
So he had practical experience in the field, fighting the Viet Cong at night. So knowing that that was there, I think Steven's eyes lit up and said, well, how can you capture a movie about the Pentagon Papers, which is all about American involvement in Vietnam, without going to Vietnam?
We are in Purchase, New York, about an hour outside New York City, which is hard to believe. You would never know you're not in a different country. We have our military advisor. He's got everyone assigned to what they'd be doing for battle, getting ready for patrolling tonight, and that's gonna take us to our big Vietnam ambush that Ellsberg's involved with. We came out here, we scouted the location, and we blocked it out with all the stunt guys, and we have people going down, we have people taking fire, people taking cover. We have 15 stuntmen. We have some of them are VC, Viet Cong, and then about 11 Marines. We had Matthew Rhys out yesterday, and it's always a concern that the actor may be at a different level than the stunt guys, but he's absolutely one of the best performers. He knows the weapons, he was falling, he was crawling around, so he did a great job.
I was very surprised that we were able to recreate the Vietnam white planes. But I actually did look at some Vietnam documentary footage, but yet I felt I didn't want to recreate that. My approach was more like what we remembered from Vietnam, rather what the Vietnam actually looked like.
She says we publish.
Hot damn.
My God.
Holy shit.
Let's get this out.
Because of social media and how malleable it is and how much truly false information is out there, we are now wrestling, I think, more so than ever with the concept of what a free press is.
We all felt that this is a relevant story to tell now because our First Amendment rights are being challenged and the Fourth Estate is being labeled fake news. And this was the time to extol the great virtues of a free press. And we felt that was one of the things our film could help to engage or re-engage this country in an honest conversation about the massive contributions that the press makes to a free nation.
The way they lied. The way they lied. Those days have to be over.
I came here for values that the country represents, and we're beginning to lose those values. I think this movie brings that importance of honesty and free press to the light.
This movie is in a long line of movies that are about people who take great risks to tell the truth, and they are the heroes.
The press is not supposed to be patting our leaders on the back. The press is not supposed to be singing praises. The press is supposed to be tough. That's their job. Their job is to keep the president honest, to keep the government honest.
You have a powerful story on your hands when you realize that everybody wants to be a part of it. We had to make this movie this year, right now. It's timely. It was the right thing to do, and it just came about in the right way.
It's kind of subversive how multiple stories are told at the same time through the narrative of this historic moment and the march to justice. And really, her taking a stance at a time when it was very difficult for her to do that. But everybody in this film does that. Every single person has risk attached to the decision that they make. And that more than anything is what I think people will feel, how just ordinary people can really change the course of history.
A lot of my films will have an epilogue that sort of rises up, and Bridge of Spies had it, and Lincoln had it. But this time I wanted to kind of jump ahead in time, just a couple of years, to show the Watergate break-in, because in a way, it follows. Without the Pentagon Papers, I don't think the Washington Post would have had the street credibility or the internal moxie to have allowed Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward to go as far as they did, following the money trail, which eventually led to Nixon's resignation.
Without the Pentagon Papers, without that definitive fight and that definitive judgment over the First Amendment, Watergate might never have happened, and the Nixon administration might not have reshaped the whole aspect of what the power of the White House is.
DC Police, 2nd Precinct.
Yes, hello, this is Frank Wills. I think we might have a burglary in progress up at Watergate.
Oh, ladies and gentlemen, this is, I think, year 44 for me and Steven.
Well, it's interesting. John usually plays all the sketches of everything he's going to perform with the full orchestra on the piano for me first. And I think just because we didn't have much time, everything was so crunched. This is one of the few times I've gone to a John Williams scoring session having not heard a note. And I just sat there and, as usual, loved every note John played. His tremendous restraint with the score, and then coming right out and being strong musically when it needed it.
I've never been in a newsroom where the clatter of 1,000 typewriters, it must have been quite a noisy environment. So I thought, well, how are you going to get any music in a newsroom? And actually, there's quite a bit of music in the film, in the newsroom. Stephen, I think good, yeah? Not too big.
None of this is.
I don't think so.
I would tell you if it was. None of it's too big.
Good. Where we don't think of it as particularly a music-driven film, as an adventure would be. But there are situations and scenes in the post where the orchestra does provide a rhythm and even, you can say, an atmosphere of the printing process. I'm amazed to watch people setting type in these beds of typesetting where they do the print. And so we have a montage in the film, which creates a lot of tension and dramatically works very well. And so the music becomes involved in this, I hope, in a constructive way. A couple of scenes have very light computerized electronic effects, which are used in Reel 1, where we see Ellsberg reading the Pentagon Papers. And in that 4 minutes or so, you hear orchestra, and then you hear electronics again, you hear orchestra again, and the electronics. It isn't as precise as electronics for the former presidents and orchestra for Ellsberg. It's more of an amorphous shaping from computerized effect and what the orchestra is doing.
May 11th, 1961. President Kennedy orders a full examination by the Defense Department of a possible commitment of U.S. forces to Vietnam.
Play into 22 is a good place to start.
Catherine, I've come to realize just how much you have at stake.
Among other things, this film has, to my eye and ear, perfect performance by Meryl Streep. There's one particular scene where she makes the decision to go ahead and print this material. And the camera's on her face, which tells a lot of story. We don't have to do much music, but we have to do something. And there's a long, very quiet accompaniment to her telephone call, and Stephen was crazy about that. How much could we have that? How much increase in volume and speed as the camera goes into her eyes? It becomes a very, very important part of the physiological aspect that takes place when we have to deal with something like that.
Let's go. Let's do it. Let's go. Let's publish.
Good. All rise. One particular moment that I remember that I thought was very successful, actually, musically, Justice Black gives his decision in favor of the newspapers to print. There's a moment of great exultation and celebration in the noisy newsroom with all the workers and so on. And the music becomes part of this whole moment of excitement and fulfillment for these people.
The vote is 6-3.
6-3, we win, and so does the tie.
More French horns. Just burn up the French horns, John.
What a privilege to have Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep in a piece like this, to be able to contribute what music I could. I love doing it.
This is our 44th year working together, believe it or not. 4 years longer than Meryl Streep's been an actress in movies.
It's so easy for the two of them to be together, but I think as an outsider, you get caught up in the fact that they've made all these monumental films that have defined our childhood and our adulthood and our lives. You think of John Williams and you think of the soundtrack of your life.
Every day seems like a new thing. Particularly with Steven, his childlike qualities, I think, generate this self-renewal that we feel with him all the time. I hope what I've done for his projects has been and will be remotely worthy of what he offers me.
It is my great privilege to welcome the Washington Post Company to the American Stock Exchange.
The Post is as much about leadership and about the birth of a leader as it is about the birth of a national paper, once a local paper called the Washington Post.
Okay, I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you keep up with it all when you have this day job.
The story of Katharine Graham is the story of a woman finding her voice. It's a personal story about her transformation from a housewife, a mother, to a powerful woman who was the first woman to be the head of a Fortune 500 company.
I was never supposed to be in this job.
My earliest memories of her, I think, are about going to her house at R Street. And even at that time, it sort of felt like going into a different world. There's a certain kind of formality to everything. And that was the world that my grandmother grew up in.
Kay Graham grew up as the daughter of a very successful businessman in a somewhat sheltered, certainly very privileged environment.
My grandfather, Eugene Meyer, my mother's father, bought the Washington Post in 1933 at a bankruptcy sale. It was a failing newspaper. Gene Meyer was a very brave man. When he bought the Post, he had never worked on a newspaper and never run a business. But he saw that a successful newspaper in Washington would be a very good business. And he worked and worked and worked to make the Post successful.
Kay Graham, Mrs. Graham, as we knew her, she married a brilliant lawyer out of Harvard, Philip Graham, who took over the leadership of the newspaper at his father-in-law's request.
And she was thrilled when her father gave the paper to her husband, Phil Graham. She was thrilled for Phil and thrilled for her father and thought her father had made a brilliant decision because of how brilliant Phil Graham was.
My father was the publisher for the next 17 years. He died in 1963, a suicide.
And my grandmother sort of unexpectedly had to take over the company at a point of real tragedy for herself. They had 4 kids. They're all amazing people, but who grew up, at this moment where in some ways their lives were really shattered.
At that point, I think most people probably expected her to sell the paper because women didn't run businesses of that size. But her other choice was to run it herself. And she thought about her father and she thought about her husband, and she decided she would try to run the business that they had put so much care into.
It was daunting to take over a company, having not worked in that company, and having really not worked until the age of 45. I think that would be pretty daunting for anybody. And my mother had really worked on charities and taken us to the park, but she really had not worked like most women do today. And of course, it was a man's world, completely.
Hello. Morning, everybody.
There were very few women in business. Women weren't expected to do much outside the realm of child raising and household keeping. Women were still a little bit invisible at that point in time.
How many reporters is that?
It's 25.
Let's not get bogged down.
There has to be quite a few.
At least a dozen. Fritz?
I think she probably wasn't the most secure, partly because she lacked experience and she knew it.
So do you think I should give up more seats on the board?
The central thing about my mother was how self-doubting she was. Kay Graham was always the world capital of self-doubt.
But she was very tenacious, she was smart, and she set about learning about the paper and about other papers. And I think over time, she gained more and more confidence.
She was determined to do this, but had doubts about how best to do it. And in finding Ben, she found the ideal partner who never had any doubts about himself.
She'd hired Ben Bradlee to be the editor in 1965. Hiring Ben was one of the few times when she said, "Oh, Don, this is going to be great. I've found the right guy. He's working so hard. He's there around the clock." That was never her reaction to a decision of hers.
That was a very tough move for her to make, because Alfred Friendly, the previous managing editor, was a very close family friend. And it took a lot for her to stand back and say, this is what's right for the paper. And she was so right.
A lot of people were scared by the prospect of working for a woman. Ben just saw a really good publisher.
Ben, I might have something. Maybe.
Well, let me know when it's a little less wishy-washy. I'm gonna go chase down a lead of my own. Ben Bradlee was a newspaper man through and through. He loved the business and he loved what the job was. To find the truth, discern what it is, and put it out there and let people decide for themselves.
He was very brash and charming and very self-confident. He thought he was always right. But the reporters loved him, which I think is a very, very important ingredient in any managing editor or any executive editor. And he attracted great talent for that reason.
I had been the social secretary for the Algerian ambassador, and so I knew a lot about Washington's social life. And I got a call one day, and it was this gruff voice, and he said, "This is Ben Bradlee, I'm the editor of the Washington Post." And of course, I knew perfectly well who he was. And he said, "I'd like to talk to you about being a party reporter." And so I went down to meet with him, and he was dazzling. I was just struck by how much charisma and how much energy and how much charm he had. And at the end, he said, "Well, can you show me something you've written?" And I said, "Well, I've never written anything before." And he said, "Well, nobody's perfect. You're hired."
The news style section, sometimes that stiletto party coverage can be a little
handling
mean.
it. I'm looking for a new editor.
Yes.
Ben was something between an uncle and a grandfather to me growing up. He was constantly at her house. We were constantly at the Bradleys, and still we're extremely close as families today. You know, we see each other all the time.
They had one of the most extraordinary relationships probably ever in the publishing world between editor and publisher.
Best friends isn't the right word, and closest colleagues isn't the right word. The word for their relationship is something else. They loved each other. And as Ben said at my grandmother's funeral, you know, the thing that he remembered most about her was the fun that they had together.
Okay. Nothing else of interest in the world, Steve?
Yes, sir. Very significant. This goddamn New York Times expose of the most highly classified documents of the war.
Oh, that. I see. I didn't read the story, but you mean that was leaked out of the Pentagon?
This is a devastating security breach of the greatest magnitude of anything I've seen.
Well, what's being done about it then? I mean, I didn't... did we know this was coming out?
No, we did not, sir.
The Pentagon Papers was a study commissioned by the Secretary of Defense under Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, who had a certain degree of guilt about where the war had gone and his responsibility for it. And he wanted future decision makers to learn from the mistakes of American policy in Vietnam. So he commissioned what was a giant lessons learned study. So it's an unusual document in that it's not operational communication. It's not a memo about some action that's going on. It's really a history. It was a secret history of the war, but commissioned while the war was still going on.
The papers were leaked by a man named Dale Ellsberg, who was an intelligence expert and had been an intelligence analyst at the Pentagon. And he worked for Bob McNamara. He was one of these really bright young men from fancy schools who populated the Defense and State Department at the time. And he was asked by McNamara to compile this history.
I was one of the first asked to be on the study because they wanted people who had either been in Vietnam, as I had been for 2 years as a civilian, or had worked at high levels, and I had, in the Pentagon and then Foreign Service Reserve 1 in Vietnam. So I met all these criteria. The study was completed in early 1969 under Nixon. And because I'd worked on the study, I was given permission to study the whole thing. It was actually 47 volumes, 7,000 pages in all, each one stamped top secret sensitive, which means not only top secret, but to be held very closely within the executive branch, even among people who had clearances, because it might be politically embarrassing.
It showed that we were really fighting an illegal war, and an unwinnable war, a war through the Truman administration, the Eisenhower administration, and then the Kennedy administration, right through the Johnson administration, and then what Nixon knew and how he was involved. And this was all part of the study.
They violated the Geneva Convention. They lied to Congress and they lied to the public. They knew we couldn't win and still sent boys to die.
It revealed that we, our presidents that is, preferred endless war in Vietnam to a political solution that we didn't like. Unification under a communist government or a nationalist government that was opposed to U.S. policy in general. We preferred the war and we imposed that on them. And that was very clear in the documents. So it was an American war, essentially, and that was not a just war. It was not a noble cause. It had no legitimacy, and to me that meant that everyone dying was unjustified homicide, and I should do what I could to end it. I began copying the papers with the intention of giving them first to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which I did. But Senator Fulbright chose not to put them out for fear, actually, that he would suffer politically for it. And ultimately, having failed to get them out, I did give them to the New York Times without any confidence that they would do it.
There were reporters, Neil Sheehan, David Halberstam, many others reporting from Vietnam and sort of telling the on-the-ground truth of the Vietnam War. But they were sometimes met with skepticism or even cynicism from journalists back in the newsroom who were hearing from the government, well, that's not true, it's going better than they say. The Pentagon Papers laid bare that deception.
I think they were lying because they thought it was the easier way to get public opinion behind them, and then they continued lying because they started doing things that weren't entirely legal. The bombings of Laos and Cambodia without the congressional approval was considered to be illegal. And then they kept on lying because the support for the war was starting to deteriorate because millions were being drafted and tens of thousands were dying in Vietnam. And they were terrified that if Americans knew the truth, that the support for the war would evaporate. And they were right.
Up until Vietnam, the American ethos is we win wars, we don't lose wars.
It was a matter of politics. They basically kept the war going because they didn't want to lose face.
And their fear of being the one who was responsible for America losing a war was more important to them than sending a lot of poor kids to die.
The only couple I knew that both Kennedy and LBJ wanted to socialize with was you and your husband, and you owned the damn paper.
At that point in time, there was really a code between the press and Kennedy and LBJ and these guys, which was, you know, they protect them in sort of a lot of ways.
Up until the Pentagon Papers time, with very few exceptions, there was very little investigative reporting or news reporting that was critical of the government at all until the Vietnam War. So the idea of publishing the Pentagon Papers was a big step in changing the relationship between the government and the press.
The Pentagon Papers was published in 1971, and I was only 15 years old at the time, but I remember how much it dominated our lives that summer.
Abe, here it is.
My father was Abe Rosenthal. He was an editor at the Times, then the editor of the Times for many, many years, including the period in which they published the Pentagon Papers, which was a huge event in the Times and in my family and in journalism.
I just remember the day that the New York Times came out with the Pentagon Papers story that was this total gloom in the Washington Post because they had this fabulous story and we didn't.
We got sucking hind tit in our own backyard.
This was a blow to Ben's ambitions for the Washington Post, that we didn't have the Pentagon Papers and the New York Times did have them.
The Post really wasn't anywhere yet on the national scene. There was really only one national newspaper, and that was the Times.
The thing, though, that Henry, that to me is just unconscionable, this is treasonable action on the part of the bastards that put it out.
It's treasonable, there's no question. It's actionable, I'm absolutely certain.
I expected to go to prison for the rest of my life. I was indicted in middle of 1971, first on 2 felony counts, but that was enlarged to 12 felony counts for a possible sentence of 115 years. I was the first person, actually, who'd revealed information to the American public to be prosecuted for it. And no one had ever been prosecuted for it before because prosecutions were held to be against the First Amendment, the guarantee of free speech and freedom of the press.
We believed more deeply in our government and didn't imagine that it would lie to us. It was a watershed experience for the nation. We never quite looked at authority and our government in the same way.
John Mitchell contacted the Times. Seems the president's going to seek an injunction.
The United States government, for the first time in the history of the United States, asked a judge to stop a newspaper from printing a story.
The Times complied with that order while they appealed it to the Supreme Court, which meant that the Post had some breathing room to catch up.
The problem was, if they went ahead and published, that was a treasonable and actionable publication.
If you got the study from the same source, that would amount to collusion.
Meaning?
We could all go to prison.
The timing couldn't have been worse for the Washington Post. They were kind of bleeding out, and they needed the IPO. They needed to go public.
A number of their institutional investors will pull out if you go ahead and publish.
And the government of the United States was saying, if you do this, we are going to destroy the company.
The Richard Nixon I know will muster the full power of the presidency, and if there's a way to destroy your paper, by God, he'll find it.
And suddenly, for somebody who had been told no, 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 no her entire life, they were like, okay, but now you have to make all the decisions. And not only do you have to make all the decisions, but you have to make the biggest decision of your life that is going to potentially destroy your husband's legacy, your father's legacy, any hope of your legacy, the legacy of this paper. She was almost all consumed by not failing.
This decision represented her ultimate fear.
What are you going to do, Mrs. Graham? He said to her, if you don't publish this, I will resign.
Let's publish.
When she, in the face of all that, said publish, I think he felt relieved. I think he felt a rush of respect for this woman who understood their job the same way that he did. It's men rattling. Run it.
Yes, sir.
They all followed your lead and published the papers.
The courts couldn't go against every newspaper in the country, and we basically had won. And not only that, but the most exciting thing for all of us was that it sort of put us in the same league with the New York Times.
Ben Bradlee and Katharine Graham created the sense that the Washington Post could and should be the other great paper in our country.
What's next?
We're going to court.
The Honorable, the Chief Justice and the Associate Justices of the Supreme Court of the United States.
The decision by the Supreme Court to uphold the paper's right to publish was a genuine turning point in freedom of the press. This is the case that is taught in every classroom, in every courtroom. It's because of this case.
From now on, ever, no reporter from the Washington Post is ever to be in the White House. Is that clear? Absolutely.
Nixon was afraid, quite reasonably, not paranoidly. He had to keep me silent. He couldn't do it just by threatening me with prison because I was already on trial, facing a life in prison.
The Nixon administration was crazy enough to send burglars to the office of his psychiatrist and go through their files to try to get information about Ellsberg.
These same people were caught in the Watergate just weeks later.
And when the judge learned about that, he threw the case out. So Ellsberg never did go to jail, but he was entirely willing to.
So our system actually performed the way it was intended to rein in imperial, monarchical lying and aggression. And Congress, the media, even individual executives and so forth, behaved as they were supposed to, and that war got ended.
When Don took over as publisher in '79, one of the things that he said that was so memorable was, "My mother gave me everything except an easy act to follow."
The stories published in the Times and now the Post have created a diplomatic and security disaster for the United States.
It's not the first time in the history of the United States that people trying to tell the truth have been criticized for it, have been called names. People now use the phrase fake news But there have always been fierce critics when news organizations do things that political leaders don't like. Those leaders are quick to criticize back. They got every right to. Newspapers aren't always right, but they're trying to be right. Good newspapers, good reporters are trying to tell the truth. And if they get something wrong, it is their absolute duty to tell the reader the next day, we got it wrong, and to keep trying and try to get the rest.
Done.
All right, get it in the paper.
Personal History, her autobiography, was one of the most compelling autobiographies I've ever read. It's a book that she took years to write, and everyone in her family would say, oh yes, Mommy's book, as if it was never going to happen. It was just someone's dream, and then it came out and it won the Pulitzer.
What I'd like to read is this one part in the book that I think really summarizes part of what she felt after the Pentagon Papers and the impact of the Pentagon Papers. From my point of view, the Post and I had been hurled onto the national scene almost unwittingly. For the first time in my professional life, we became major players. Eyes were on us. What we did mattered to the press and to the country. To some degree, I gained a measure of self-assurance. This was my first serious visibility on the national scene. I was very publicly exposed, written about, photographed, and interviewed, which both seared me and to some extent fed my ego. The pressure, the intensity, and the rapidly unfolding developments were another extraordinary